Okay, so now that we've been working with HTML for a little while, what we're going to do is kind of baby step our way up this little ladder here and just dip our toe into CSS because I think it's important to understand, like, here's the basics of how you can actually make it start to look like what you want it to look like. HTML, for the most part, isn't very sexy. It's pretty bland. Like I said, all it is labeling things. So there's not much finesse, there's not much personality in it. So if you think of it as like grammar when you're writing, but the CSS is the creative part. That's where you start to add your style or your flavor or your tone to things. So I think it's important to kind of try out in this first module. So keep that in mind. HTML is that content. It's just labeling content. CSS is the presentation part, right? So presentation meaning we're going to make this look like what we want it to look like. It's going to have rows and columns. It's going to have fonts. It's going to have colors. It's going to have buttons. All that kind of thing is going to start to happen. And keep in mind, as we kind of move up here, the richness and user experience starts to increase, right? So there's more to interact with and more to look at. Okay, so I did this in another video, but if we go to, like, one of the pages we've been building and just disable everything, you can see this is what the HTML looks like. And when we turn it back on, it has all the fonts and colors and rows and columns. So that's what we're kind of moving towards, is really just figuring out how to do that. Now, when you look at things, the biggest thing with CSS is to be able to describe what you're trying to do. Right? So this is just maybe a technique to keep in mind. But if you have your design, if you have what you want it to look like, that's a whole lot easier to build than to try to just write CSS from scratch. So if we look at Instagram's site, if we were going to make this, we have this paragraph here, which probably is some kind of heading, right? And it's kind of gray. It's got a sans serif font. It's centered. The text is. So all that stuff is what we would write out in CSS. So it's essentially just a list of rules. We would select this part and we would say, hey, we want that font to be a sans serif font. We want it to be text align centered, and we want it to be kind of this gray color, right? So all those things start to create what we want it to look like. The hardest part about CSS is that selecting part, so like selecting this particular part. So that's what we're going to talk about as we kind of move forward. So if we switch back into brackets and kind of go back to, we have our HTML here. So now we want to turn on our CSS. So this may be where you want to do the split view. So again, this little icon in the top left, there's a vertical split view. And you can drag the CSS down, and we have the HTML and the CSS side by side. I'm going to kind of zoom out a little bit so the HTML doesn't look so crazy, and I'm going to kind of move this over a little bit so you can kind of see it a little bit better there. Okay, so I didn't mention them here, but this is what's called a comment, so it's not going to show up in the CSS, and then this is what's called a comment in an HTML, but they just don't show up. You can write yourself notes in the code if you want to. So CSS is just a list of rules, so it's not terribly complex. Like I said, if you can describe what you want, all you're doing is selecting something and then going to write out what you want it to look like. Okay, so we can write out a basic style here before we end this video. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to change the background color of the entire page to really whatever color you want. So think about kind of how you want this to look like, your kind of color scheme and the font and that sort of thing that you want it to look like. And that's what you can kind of start with. But how you do this is we're going to select the body, and then we're going to open and close brackets, right? So this kind of format is what you see a lot. And then the declaration is tabbed in. So this is what you kind of have here. And then what we're going to do is we want to change the background. So this is what I mean by if you can describe it. It'll give you that list like in HTML. We want the background color, and let's just say for the sake of being able to see it right now, we want it to be blue-violet, whatever blue-violet is, right? And then the last bit is this semicolon right here, and that's the part that everybody forgets. but every line needs to have a semicolon. Okay, so we have something that looks like this, right? This is called a selector, and this is called a declaration. There's a style and a value, and CSS is really just a long list of what this should look like, right? There's different kinds of selectors that we're going to talk about. This is called an element selector, but if you see something that starts with a hashtag, same kind of thing. This is called an ID selector, and if it starts with a period, this is called a class, right? So ID, class, and this is called an element, right? Now, the element is just the HTML tag, right? So you can see that there's the body that it's selecting, so it's going to find every HTML tag that's called body and apply this style. Right now there's only one, and it's right here, but we talked about how the body is the entire page. So we have our background color of blue-violet and the body. Now there's one trick to this. If we if we save this really quick, and saving it when you have split view, you got to make sure you click on each side. But when you live preview this, you won't see anything happen, right? If we select our HTML, you're not going to see that purple. And if we go back into brackets, and if we try to live preview our CSS, it's going to not like that, right? It's going to give us an error. So if you ever get this, it means you're trying to preview the CSS. So hit OK, and make sure you click inside the HTML, or the HTML selected over here, and now when you live preview it, it should work. Okay, so the next video, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about hooking that up and then writing a little bit more CSS as we get rolling with CSS.